Old structures and buildings are sometimes demolished to make way for new construction projects. Out with the old and in with the new, but these demolitions can sometimes go wrong, resulting in a mess. Here are the top 15 structured ruins gone wrong. Number 15. Ohio Edison Mad River Power Plant. First opened in 1927, the Mad River Power Plant in Springfield, Ohio had a 20-megawatt steam turbine driven by coal burning. After subsequent upgrades, it was responsible for providing at least a third of the town's power needs. Following concerns about pollution, it was finally closed in 1981. However, it wouldn't be until 2010 that demolition experts moved in to remove the building so the land could be rebuilt upon. The main structure that had to be dealt with was the chimney stack. After extensive surveys, the explosions were carefully placed and detonated, but there had been an oversight. They failed to adequately cut the rebar on the rear of the stack, used more explosives than usual, and used delayed detonators. This combined to create instability in the way it collapsed, and it was so out of control that it fell in the opposite direction that had been intended, with workers having no choice but to watch events unfold. Rubble destroyed 2 active turbines and 2 12,500-volt power lines, leaving more than 4,000 homes without power for several hours and causing an estimated $19 million worth of damage. In the years following, there were protracted lawsuits to determine who was at fault, but the power company blamed the demolition company they had hired for the project. Number 14. The Pontiac Silverdome, one of the most recognizable structures in Pontiac, Michigan. The Silverdome was an 83,000-seat stadium that first opened in 1975 and was, for 25 years, the largest capacity venue in the NFL, home to the Detroit Lions. It was also used for several other events, such as the NBA, the FIFA World Cup, and WrestleMania 3. However, when Ford Field opened in Detroit, the Silverdome was left without a purpose and remained empty for 8 years. Attempts were made to revitalize the stadium before being sold to new owners, but by 2017, the decision had been made to demolish it so the 199-acre site could be reused for something else. The plan was to bring down the structure in several stages, with explosives set to implode the upper section in December of 2017. However, when the time had come to carry out the controlled procedure, things didn't go entirely to plan. The explosives detonated, and there were a few puffs of smoke, but the upper section remained in place. According to the demolition company, a tenth of the explosives had failed to go off for some reason, and while they were sure that it would eventually collapse, they weren't able to say precisely when that would happen. To control this risk, they returned the following day to finish the job. It took a few more months to tear down the rest of the structure. In 2019, it was announced that Amazon would begin building a warehouse on the site, and the Silverdome became little more than a distant memory. Number 13. Australian Beer Silo. Let's be honest, Australia isn't exactly short of buildings used in beer production, but it seemed as if a demolition crew had been sampling. The product was in 2010 when they attempted to bring down a structure west of Brisbane. The silo had been standing for 50 years and was used to store malt for the nearby brewery due to changing needs of the land. However, the decision had been made to clear it so it could be returned to the landlord, who was the local train authority, to construct a new transport link to the city. More than 220 pounds of explosives had been packed inside the building, but after initially appearing to be well on its way to collapsing, it settled in place at an angle. According to the manager of the demolition company, there's always a risk that something like this can happen. There's a fine line between using too much or not enough explosives. On this occasion, they didn't entirely use enough to finish the job. Locals were unsure what would happen at the newly formed Leaning Tower, but the demolition experts had a backup plan. It stood like this for just 40 minutes while workers removed more of the structural supports. Then, in the end, all it took was a nudge from the excavator to push it over. All that was left was the massive job of removing the 4,400 tons of rubble before new construction works could begin. Number 12. St. Petersburg Sports and Concert Complex. The St. Petersburg Sports and Concert Complex was opened in 1980. It became a focal point for entertainment in the region, hosting everything from tennis and bowling competitions to concerts by some of the world's most famous artists. As with everything, though, it reached the end of its useful lifespan and was scheduled for demolition in early 2020 so that the world's largest ice arena could be built in its place. Demolishing structures like this isn't simply a case of attaching explosives and detonating them. It requires extensive surveys to understand where the weight is being supported. Precision cuts are made to ensure they will collapse safely and effectively. Unfortunately, something tragically went wrong during that process. On this occasion, while workers were removing the connections between the stadium's walls and roof, it suddenly collapsed without warning of what was about to happen. Workers were still inside and on top of the building, and unfortunately, not all were able to escape. One person died during this tragic event, and several others were injured. This is a brutal example of how difficult it is to safely demolish buildings, especially in an industry that is highly regulated in most places around the world. Number 11. Flower factory. One of the difficulties with demolishing buildings is that you can't be entirely sure how sturdy a structure is until you try to knock it down. If you make a miscalculation, it can lead to devastating consequences. The best example caught on camera occurred in Turkey in 2009 when workers attempted to clear a disused factory so a new shopping center could be built on its site. Built in 1928, the 82-foot-tall building was once a flower factory and was central to the local economy. It had long gone out of business, though, and because it was so old, there weren't any records that detailed exactly how it had been built. Demolition experts made the best guess they could about how to proceed, and once they were ready, they detonated the explosives. Instead of falling neatly to the ground as had been expected, one side of the building collapsed faster, and it began to lean over. To everyone's surprise, it not only fell down on one side but retained enough momentum to keep rolling and flipped over onto its roof, with most of the building remaining intact. It landed frighteningly close to a nearby residential apartment, and it was only the presence of a muscular wall that prevented it from causing significant damage. Number 10. Crimean residential building. Sevastopol is the largest city on the Crimean Peninsula and has been an important economic and strategic port on the Black Sea for a long time. It was part of Ukraine but came under the jurisdiction of Russia in 2014. When troops annexed the peninsula, authorities immediately began planning the area's redevelopment. One of their main targets was what they perceived to be illegally built residential buildings due to safety risks and the need for land to build industrial facilities. Therefore, at the end of 2014, several buildings were demolished. While most projects went without any problems, there was one that didn't entirely go to plan. The 10-story building was full of explosives, and smoke billowed out of the structure when they were detonated. It began to fall, but the charges hadn't done as much damage as they should have, so instead of collapsing to the ground, it stayed standing, albeit at a precarious angle. According to locals, workers had purposefully used fewer explosives than they usually would have to prevent any damage from occurring to nearby buildings. This was why the structure didn't entirely fall. While the strange leaning block became a famous sight in the city for a while, the job was finally completed a few weeks later. Number 9. The Husi Generating Station. After opening in 1969, the Dalhousie Generating Station was a coal and oil-fired power station that could generate up to 315 megawatts of energy for local communities in New Brunswick, Canada. It remained in operation until 2012, when, despite protests from locals for fear of job loss, the decision was made that it was no longer economical to run. Assessments were done to determine how best to clear the area for reuse in 2015. The time had come to demolish the building and its smokestack, with crowds gathering to witness the demise of the iconic landmark for themselves. The loud explosions echoed around the area, part of the main structure began to fall, and a plume of smoke billowed out from the stack, but this wasn't precisely the destructive event that everyone had expected. The plan was for it to fall straight down, but instead, only the front side of the building was taken out in the blast. The smokestack only dropped by 16 feet as the entire upper section of the stack was so heavy that it firmly landed in place and was surprisingly structurally sound. Despite what had happened, an entirely new survey was required to understand precisely what had gone wrong and what needed to be done. The second attempt occurred within a month, and it was successfully completed. We are constantly adding more people to the Top 5's production team to bring you all the best content. Be sure to subscribe with notifications on and hit the like button. Number 8. Danish Silo. In April 2018, hundreds of people gathered near the shore of a harbor on board in Denmark to see the skyline change for good. A silo that had stood tall for as long as anyone could remember was scheduled for demolition. It was one of the latest stages of a project to revitalize the old ferry town. Demolition experts had placed explosives at binding sites around the base of the silo, and after a final check to make sure everything had been set up right, they were ready to pull the trigger. A large wedge had been cut from the structure to control the direction it fell. As the charges were detonated, plumes of dust shot out around it, and there were cheers of excitement from onlookers. These soon turned to gasps when instead of dropping in the planned direction, the silo fell in the opposite direction. This unfortunately meant that the debris from the falling 173-foot tower showered down over the neighboring cultural center, which contains a library and a music school. Firefighters had to work through the night to help secure the structural integrity of the building, but fortunately, they were able to save it. A significant amount of damage had already been caused. The front wall had been knocked through, and the interior was completely covered in dust. It's just lucky that no one was there at the time. Number 7. The Leaning Tower of Dallas. Not all building parts are constructed equally, which led to bizarre scenes in Dallas, Texas, in 2020, when the attempted demolition of an 11-story office building resulted in the accidental creation of a temporary landmark, the Leaning Tower of Dallas. City officials had secured funding for a new $2.5 billion development that includes residential properties, workspaces, and entertainment venues. The only thing standing in its way was the old office tower. It was an exciting moment, and people came from all across the city to see it collapse to the ground. But while things appeared to be going to plan, something unexpected happened. The first explosives detonated around the building, and smoke could be seen coming out of the windows before the multiple charges brought it tumbling down to the ground. What the demolition team hadn't taken into account, however, was that the elevator shaft was built from far stronger materials than the rest due to accommodating the mechanism, and didn't crumble like the building around it. Once the dust had settled, the shaft had fallen several feet and was leaning to one side. Workers were too precarious to get close enough to finish it. Over the following days, there was a petition to leave the Leaning Tower standing as a new tourist attraction. Still, it was finally destroyed by a wrecking ball so the new construction project could begin. Number 6. Liverpool Apartments. Due to the need to provide quick and cheap accommodation to people in the decades following the Second World War, most British cities have large residential blocks that are now seen as unsightly and are being removed in favor of new structures with improved designs. At the same time, they may look like a blight on the skylines. They were indeed built to last, which can cause problems when it's time for them to be demolished. In 2016, 2 towers in Liverpool were scheduled for destruction, known as Churchill House and Montgomery House. On the first day, the explosions were detonated around their foundations, but neither of the 14-story buildings moved. The next day, they tried again, and on this occasion, Churchill's house collapsed as expected, but Montgomery's house remained standing tall. It was only on the third attempt that they had more success. Still, even then, all that happened was around a quarter of the tower fell cables that had to be tied around it to pull the supports from beneath it. Cranes were used to break it floor by floor so it would fail, and finally, the project was completed much later than planned. Number 5. Zip Feed Mill Tower. The Zip Feed Mill Tower stood between 1957 and 2005 as the tallest structure that people could go inside in the whole of South Dakota. However, plans to use the land to build new residential and office buildings meant that the former feed mill in Sioux Falls, which stood at the height of 202 feet, had to be demolished. The demolition team had cut through the reinforcing bars of the building and placed explosives around the base and some of the vertical columns. But when they were detonated, all that happened was that the floor was successfully destroyed instead of triggering the entire collapse of the building. The rest of the building fell on top of the basement, but it supported itself while leaning to one side. There had simply not been enough explosives to break the vertical integrity of the structure. Instead of attempting the demolition again, the unpredictable danger of how the system had supported itself meant that the demolition crew had to take it down layer by layer with a crane and a wrecking ball. Thank you. Number 4. Miami Condos. Great care is taken to ensure that when demolishing a building, it will only start to collapse once the area is cleared, and most importantly, everyone has had a chance to get to safety. But sometimes things can take place before anyone expects them to, and that can result in deadly consequences. In 2018, workers were preparing a condo in Miami for destruction, but it was already far weaker than surveyors had realized. They were in the process of placing explosives around Marlborough House when suddenly the building collapsed of its own accord. Witnesses say they didn't hear any explosions and that the only sound was crumbling concrete. Still, it shows not everyone was evident when it happened. Luckily, the residents had been evacuated well ahead of time. Only one worker was injured, but it could have been so much worse. Investigations into the incident found that it was the process of cutting through the support beams of the building that had caused the problem. This is the standard procedure in demolitions. It's a requirement to make sure they fall down in a controlled manner, but it turned out that they were all keeping this condo standing in the first place. So once they were gone, there was only one thing that was going to happen. Number 3. Chinese residential building. Every building is built slightly differently, and this process makes demolitions all the more difficult. There isn't one set process of how to effectively raise a structure, and a carefully considered plan of action has to be created. Before anything could begin in December of 2009, everything was set to bring down a 22-story residential building in Luoyang, China. From the moment you see what the structure looks like, you can tell that it was no ordinary demolition. Because of the way the building had been designed, the only safe way to flatten it was to arrange explosives around the foundations to split them in two, which would both fall independently. There was, however, a significant miscalculation, and nowhere near enough explosives were used. Once they were detonated, half of the building collapsed onto its side on the ground, and the other simply dropped a few feet and appeared as if it was about to fall over but remained standing at a precarious slant. In this state, it would have been far too dangerous for workers to enter to place other explosives. So, to finish the job, workers spent the next week disassembling it with a crane. Number 2. The Anglesey Power Station. The Anglesey Power Station was a coal-burning power plant in Victoria, Australia that was first opened in 1969 to ignite the fuel that had been dug out of the nearby mine. Its role was to provide power to an aluminum smelter. However, once that facility closed in 2014, there was little need for the power station, along with increasing concerns about the pollution that was being emitted from it. Anglesey was completed later that year, and work was soon underway to remove critical elements from the structure. The outer shell that remained was ready to be demolished in 2018. Only the building was scheduled to be brought down, with the chimney planned to be dealt with at a future date. Still, even this limited scope was beyond the demolition company's capabilities. The charges detonated amidst a cloud of thick black smoke, and the bunkers and the conveyor fell to the ground. However, the rest remained firmly standing. This was far from ideal for the holding company. It meant that further attempts would have to be made to destroy the building, but also because rumors started spreading that there was likely asbestos in the structure at the time of the partial collapse. This material could have been applied to the surrounding area. After an in-depth investigation, the power company was told it should have brought in specialized experts with experience demolishing a building like this. They were lucky it hadn't led to more severe complications. Number 1. Toxic smokestack. The last thing anyone wants to hear is that their neighborhood has been coated in potentially toxic fumes and debris. But that's exactly what residents of a little village in Chicago were faced with in 2020. The Crawford coal-fired power plant had been in operation for 96 years but was closed in 2012 after sustained pressure from the local community, concerned about its environmental impact. Little did they know that their actions would prove their concerns to be true in the worst possible way in mid-April 2020. The smokestack had been surrounded by explosives, and with people watching from around the city, it fell to the ground just as had been planned. However, what hadn't been accounted for was the massive amount of dust and debris that was thrown up into the air. At first, you could hardly see your hand in front of your face in Little Village. People started noticing the fine particles that were suspended in the air. This would have been worrying enough during regular times, but with the compounded concerns of the COVID-19 respiratory illness and tests showing that the particles could have contained asbestos and countless other chemicals that had accrued over the years, people were understandably worried. Once things had settled, there was a thin layer of debris across the entire neighborhood, and the cleanup operation could commence. The company behind the demolition was left to answer a number of questions, though most importantly, why they didn't ensure the dust cloud was minimized or warn locals that there would have been so much of it, and why was it even necessary to carry out the work in the middle of a pandemic? Subscribe to Amazing World for more.